January 30th, 1649 was a somber day for most in London. King Charles I, Charles Stuart, who had been born in 1600, and since the time he was 3 years old, had been in the royal palace, was meeting his fate. He became king himself in 1625, but immediately got into arguments over the growing and powerful Parliament that he needed in order to levy taxes, in order to finance various wars, military improvements, and other infrastructure, as well as his own expenses. This led to war, and from 1642 to 1645, the forces of the king and the forces of Parliament fought a battle all over the countryside in England. He lost that war. It's hard to imagine this moment as he's brought from Westminster to Whitehall, to a tiny room with a candle. He has his papers and letters destroyed. He talks to his advisors one last time, prays with the Bishop of London. Then he speaks to the two children that are still in England, his eldest sons, knowing that they may be future kings, escape. His wife, member of the royal family in France, escapes there. He speaks with his daughter Elizabeth, daughter sobbing. "It is great to see you," he says. "I have something to tell you. But, sweetheart, you will forget this." "No," she replies, I will never forget this for the rest of my life." "Tell your brother to obey your older brother," this is Charles II he's referring to, "as sovereign." Seeing her crying, he says, "No, this will be a glorious death for the laws and liberty of the land." His son Henry, youngest, comes in. He tells him, "Son, they will now cut off your father's head." He had offered no defense at trial. He had not accepted the authority of the court. "By what authority am I tried?" he told the prosecutors. "The prisoner will not require." They merely wanted a pleading from him, which he refused to give. "By what authority am I tried? For if power without laws may make law, then I do not know what subject in England there is that may be sure of his life." "You are in a court," he was assured. "I see before me a power," he said. The sergeant was ordered to take away the prisoner. There were still negotiations. Scots, the French, the Dutch Republic, the Venetian Republic, all were asking for Charles's life. But the parliamentary forces in London and the increasing radicalization, the levelers movement, seeking to level the elites and equalize power among those in the army, were influential at this point. There was to be no sparing. And at 2 o'clock on the 30th of January, 1649, drums start banging. This is the point at which Charles has chosen. They've given him the choice of the hour to die. Soldiers line the Privy Gallery in Whitehall and the entrance to the banqueting house where the execution is to happen. Soldiers hold back a wall of people praying loudly. And the king appears with great flourish in his robes, long gray hair, his pointed beard, and a garter band on his left knee with 412 diamonds. He smiles at the people who have lined up to see. He's accompanied by halberdiers in the front and to his back. As he approaches, he notes the scaffold is draped in black, and it is set far back from the people, so they will not hear his speech today. But he's with his friend, the Bishop of London, who will record the events. The executioner is wearing a fishnet mask. He wants no one to know his identity. Still in history, it's not really known who it is. Now, it could be the younger Geoffrey, who was the official executioner of the city of London. But he had made protests about performing this execution. But it's possible that it was, because they would need a person who could complete this activity without incident. He's wearing a fishnet mask and a false beard, taking no chances. He will be brought on a barge and whisked away after this execution, so his identity will not be known. Charles asks the executioner if there's not a higher block to be had. This one is 6 inches from the ground. It will require the king to lie down flat. No, it's said by the executioner, this will be most efficient. In other words, you want this to be as clean as possible. The king is mollified, takes out his paper, and makes his speech, noting that since no one will hear me, I will speak to you, the assembled small group. None of the leading figures, like Fairfax or Oliver Cromwell, that had anything to do with his downfall in the English Civil War, are in the room at the time. They're all elsewhere. Soldiers, the executioner and his assistant, and his own assistant, the Bishop of London, Juxton. He forgives his oppressors. I know not who they are, but they have committed a sin, the great sin of regicide. He says he never wished to take Parliament's authority away, but that his own authority was being taken away. God, he said, will never prosper until you give him his due, give the king his due. Then there's a moment where a soldier rustles against the blade of the axe. Take care of the axe, Charles shouts. He's very concerned that this axe be in good condition, for obvious reasons. Don't hurt the axe that will hurt me. Then he goes back. I desire the people's liberty as much as anybody. Liberty and freedom lie in the rule of law. A subject and a sovereign, he argues, in this empty chamber, but recorded for history, are two clean different things. I am a martyr of the people. I die a Christian, according to the profession of the Church of England, as left to me by my father. Then he asks the executioner, does my hair trouble you? Yes, the executioner says. His assistant takes the hair and pulls it to the side as he lies down, head on the block. The story of Charles I, as it turns out, is not just about the English Civil War, though that's important. British liberties, although that's certainly important. But there are some elements in what happened in the 1640s, particularly how politics were conducted, that might be useful for understanding what's going on in 2017. It's hard to think of a king as a defender of the law and a defender of liberties. But that's exactly one of the points of the book that we're going to discuss, The White King, Charles I, Traitor, Murderer, and Martyr, by Leanda de Lisle. She's a best-selling author of Tudor and Stuart history. Tudor, her biography of the Tudor family, 1437 to 1603, was a Sunday Times bestseller and a History Today Book of the Year. She joins me on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And that's a lot of descriptors there about Charles I, traitor, murderer, and martyr, and some very different things. Why'd you pick Charles I as a subject?
Well, he was my favorite subject, actually, when I was a teenager. I think it was the first serious history books I started reading were about Charles I, written by a woman called C.V. Wedgwood. And I thought the time had come to revisit Charles again now.
In the United States, we're just not very king-friendly, having earned our independence, fighting a king. I do think yours presents a little bit of a different image. Charles I is not only perhaps someone who met a bad fate, but also perhaps someone who was defending the rights of minorities.
Well, he had virtues as well as failings, as most of us do. He was a decent man. That's one of the things. I mean, he was highly principled. He was extremely brave. He failed as a king in the end, and he had his head chopped off. So he certainly got punished for it. But he wasn't a failure every moment of his life, and he had successes as well as failures. And those who replaced him didn't do a much better job.
Talk a bit about how he got into trouble.
Well, I think that there was trouble brewing before Charles became king. That was part of the problem. There were people who had wanted to take power away from the crown, ostensibly for Parliament or perhaps for themselves, since the reign of Elizabeth, and it was Charles's fate to have to confront them during his own reign. So the story of the Tudors really was still hadn't really found its resolution until the reign of Charles I.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yes, I think the problem was one of essentially about religion and politics and where exactly the power and sovereignty lay, how much of it lay in the person of the king, how much of it was mixed. There was a mixed form of sovereignty between the king and Parliament, and where the balance of power should lie. That was a part of the problem, and there was a breakdown in trust, which meant that rather than listening to each other, people stopped listening to each other, and it ended up in a sort of horrific civil war.
And Charles was not a great political navigator between some of these forces of the Parliament, that the members of Parliament that wanted more power, and those who did support the monarchy. He
was very bad at reading people. I think that was one of the problems with Charles. He couldn't read people easily, and so that made him lack confidence in dealing with people politically. And he also lacked ruthlessness in the sense that he was loath to cut off heads. So where the Tudors were at once brilliant at knowing who to please and when, they were also very good at knowing who to kill and when, and would do so without a moment's hesitation. Whereas Charles was quite reluctant on the whole to chop off heads and disembowel people in public.
And it is interesting to see in all of the conflict that's going to happen between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers and the English Civil War. Definitely, if it's thought of at all in the United States, there's probably a romantic image of it, and we have some history with people shouting Cromwell and during our own revolution and citing it's on that side of history. It was interesting to see some New World connections, that there were some people who some of the proponents of the New World were operating against the king, and then some people were even coming back from the Massachusetts colony to go fight in the old country.
Yes, and I know I found that very interesting. Exactly, when we know about the Puritans leaving England and arriving in New England, we don't hear so much about them going back again, but they very much did, and they played a very important part in the English Civil War. They were leading figures as soldiers and politicians. They were absolutely in the heart of the action, and were very much involved in bringing Charles down, and in the end in chopping off his head.
And, this is the 1640s, so that really the Massachusetts colony had just formed, and already there is interest in from the Connecticut colony and others to come back and fight. But and that's why I think in our history we still have probably a positive image, and our revolution came as a result of fighting against the British king, and we saw the British king in Parliament, both really in that case as restraining our liberty. So there's a romantic image of the English Civil War, if there is any thought in today's American history teaching about the English Civil War at all. It's somewhat romantic, and in America we're probably lean Roundhead slightly, but
yes, I do present a slightly different image in my book.
And that's what I think. So perhaps there's a different way to see things, because behind the cause against Charles I, there is also a lot of radical, and not a radically progressive group, but a radically unprogressive group, religious fanatics, people who wanted to restrict rights and seize power for themselves. Maybe you could talk about the people behind the Roundhead cause and the Puritans and the like.
Yes, they were not only fanatically anti-Catholic, but also fanatically against other forms of Protestantism, certainly Lutheranism, or even sort of milder forms of Calvinism that they didn't approve of. So they were certainly not sort of keen on giving rights to those sorts of people. And they, just before the Civil War broke out, the leaders really tried to divide people more. I suppose raise hatreds, raise fears by claiming, for example, that Catholics, of which there were very few in England at this time, were storing weapons and, could rise up at any moment and kill good Protestants in their bed. And there was a rebellion going on in Ireland at one point, and they exaggerated atrocity stories again, and raised mobs and set mobs on Catholic houses, and started executing priests. Some of these priests were in their 80s. They were tortured to death in public. They were castrated while conscious, had their insides taken out. Horrific.
These were not great people. These don't sound like great people.
No, they weren't. Well, not all of them, certainly.
I suppose there's something they feared, that perhaps there'd be a takeover of England by one of the Catholic kingdoms.
Yes, I think there was the 30 Years' War was going on in Europe, and the forces of the Counter-Reformation seemed to be winning against Protestants. But on the other hand, the French, who were a Catholic kingdom, actually ended up doing more for Protestants in the 30 Years' War than the Roundheads ever did. That's the truth. I mean, politics is always complicated. You get dynastic rivalries as well as religious rivalries. But certainly what was going on in Europe was a factor to what happened in England, fear of Counter-Reformation victory.
And he stokes those fears in his choice of a wife who became the queen became a target of the populists and opponents to the ground. Did she not? Yes,
she did. Very unfairly. Henrietta Maria, after whom Maryland is named, she was, in fact, when she first arrived in England, she was called Henry, so you nearly had Henryland rather than Maryland, I think. But anyway, yes, she was a French princess. She was a daughter of the great Henri IV, who was a great warrior king, and she was quite a warrior queen. She was a very remarkable woman. She was Catholic, of course, and this was used against her and against the king, and it was sort of claimed that she was influencing Charles because Charles was reforming the Church of England, not on Catholic lines, but he was moderating some of the Church of England's Calvinism. So he instead of the focus being on kind of sermons and extempore prayers, there'd be more kind of ritual, there'd be more art, that kind of thing, more sort of high church Protestantism. So they claimed that this was all because Henrietta Maria was influencing him, and she was sort of cast as a kind of Eve to his Adam, leading him astray. And again, mobs were raised against her as well.
And when people hear like a term like high church, so we're talking about high church, meaning the church is the central church is powerful versus a lower church.
High church in England really means more sort of a more ritualistic form of Protestantism. A more ritualistic form of Protestantism.
Might be closer to Catholicism.
Exactly. It looks close. Exactly. Visually, certainly, it looks closer to Catholicism.
And we have the Episcopal Church here, which branched off that.
Exactly.
During the Revolution, they were the more loyalist or more reconciliationist.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because that's the sort of the king's religion, really.
And you talk a lot about raising mobs, and it really speaks to the politics of today. And that's why I found this book. And a reminder that I am speaking with Leanda de Lisle. That is her last name. If you're typing it into Amazon, is Delisle. The White King is her book. Charles I, Traitor, Murderer, Martyr. And I think it's so interesting. It's a story of tragedy. It's a rich story of conflict, and of a lot of people thinking they're in their own minds, thinking they're doing the right thing, but leading to an outcome that maybe wasn't the greatest. Perhaps talk a bit about that, the use of mobs in the conflict between Charles I and the Parliament.
Yes, it's I suppose to get support. I mean, because if you're going to have a civil war, obviously you need to have get as many people on your side as possible. So the kind of Roundhead side, the so-called parliamentarian side, although I should say there was only a portion of Parliament who supported the opposition to the king, thought really deliberately to be divisive and look for things that people were afraid of, for example, the Counter-Reformation in Europe, but it would also employ mobs. Really, these mobs this was organized violence, that they would raise them and they would call them and they would send them to descend on Parliament, to bully MPs into voting the way the opposition wanted, or to intimidate the king and the queen, the king in particular, when they wanted, for example, him to execute his leading minister.
Oh, the Earl of Strafford. That's right.
That's right.
And his inability to rescue Strafford, really weighed on him. And it showed I think it's one example of his lack of kind of political prowess, really weighed on him and maybe emboldened the enemies.
Yes, I'm sure it did, and it was because Charles signed this man's death warrant, knowing that he was innocent of treason, and it was something that weighed on his conscience for the rest of his life. And in fact, when he was executed, I believe that he saw himself as a murderer. He was accused of being a murderer in his trial, a traitor and murderer, which is part of the title of the book. But I think Charles believed himself to be a murderer, and he believed himself to be Strafford's murderer, because he had signed that death warrant knowing that he was innocent. And he had done so because he was afraid for his kingdom and for his family, but he'd been persuaded it was the right thing to do, but he knew it was the wrong thing, and he never forgave himself for it.
And before his death, there are significant battles in the English Civil War. The Royalists do win a few.
Yeah, they do. Many years.
And the Roundheads, or the parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell, get organized. There's the new model army, and the military history is a fascinating subject in and of itself of this war. The end of it all is that the parliamentary forces are victorious. He surrenders actually to the Scots. Is that right?
He does. That's right. He does. Yes. And they sell him for sort of 30 pieces of silver, or did they sell him to the English Parliament?
Yeah, and some of the Scottish people are mad because they thought they could get more, right?
Yes. I don't think they ever thought that they were going to chop off Charles's head, the Scots, because of course he was their king too.
Yeah, what led to that? Do you think there's any chance that he could have survived that after he had lost the war? Not in the total conflict, but and looking at every move, but after he was captured, did he have any chance of surviving?
If he had given way to all their demands, then yes, and had become completely a puppet king, then he would have survived. But there were things that he was not prepared. There were lines that he was not prepared to cross. He was not prepared to give up his friends to execution after what had happened to Strafford. He was not going to do that again. That was one thing. And secondly, it was his religious beliefs. He was prepared to suspend episcopacy, that is, church government by bishops. But he was not prepared to say that bishops weren't divinely ordained, because he believed that they were, and that was a part of his religious belief, and he would not move on that.
Because to do so would have been so dishonorable to his family. I think you make that the point of this king's death is so poignant in the book. And that moment, which really, and I'm sure there have been movies, but it just does read like a movie scene where he gives his last goodbyes to his wife, his family, to his friends. And he goes to death proud in a sense because he's standing up for the long history of his family, but also the protection of minorities and people. It's
not so much for minorities, but he believes that he represents the law. He's been executed against English law, as it stood. Laws had to be reinvented, basically, to chop his head off. He was accused of treason, but treason in English law was action against a king, so a king couldn't commit treason against himself. And what he said was that, if they can do this to me, they can do this to any of you. There is no law. I am the representative of the law, and because I'm not giving way to them, I am a martyr for the people. Because that was one of the points of kingship, really, was to be a protector of the law. That was one of the reasons they existed.
Yes, it's a funny moment even in American politics. I think there's a lot of reflection right now. Not that I think Americans are like, let's go with the monarchy anytime
no,
soon.
I don't think you need to do that.
But
Although it might be better in some other parts of the world.
It's true. It's true. Because there's this sense that, the democratic government can also can err and make decisions, and there's so much fighting and conflict that often it doesn't always lead to good political outcomes because nobody can get anything done at the very least, or horrible things are being done at the worst. In this example, in the 1640s, the late 1640s, there's then, after the king is beheaded, rump parliament, then essentially a dictatorship. And I don't think that England was very happy during those years. Am I wrong?
No, I think they hated it. Christmas was abolished. They didn't like that. Even one of the rebellions was triggered actually by the abolition of Christmas.
Oh, I did want to talk a bit about that because there's a current political issue about the war on Christmas every time here. At the Starbucks coffee shops that are here, I don't know if they're in the I assume the Starbucks is there.
Starbucks.
They're everywhere. Okay. Talk about an invading army. That is a...
Absolutely.
But, there's a big argument because they say happy holidays on the cups instead of Merry Christmas. So here there's some hysteria over the war on Christmas that's occurring. And it is interesting to see in history in the 1647 that there was actually a war on Christmas. You have a passage where in Canterbury in 1647, the town crier comes out and says that Christmas Day was canceled and no one can even hang a rosemary or a holly or bay or any kind of superstitious herb on their house.
Yeah, no mince pies. No, absolutely. It was and it did trigger a revolt. People didn't like being told they couldn't enjoy themselves, but it was considered to be, again, Christmas was considered to be a Catholic holy day. Holiday, as we would now call it, and so Puritans didn't approve of it. In fact, I don't think, certainly in Scotland, Christmas wasn't a public holiday until I think the 1950s, Scotland being a Presbyterian country, and I think in the United States, I don't think Christmas was a holiday until I think the first third of the 19th century, quite late.
Well, we certainly had a Puritan influence. There's no doubt that after the war was finished, many of them came to Massachusetts, and that was the bedrock, the high population.
I think I don't know, but I would imagine that the whole worry about Christmas and happy holidays is really, in a way, it's a kind of sort of struggle for good manners, isn't it? Everyone wants to be polite, so you don't want to. You worry if I say Happy Christmas to someone who isn't Christian, will it? Here, I don't think we're so bothered about that. We're happy to say Happy Christmas, Happy Diwali, happy whatever someone's particular thing is.
That's the crux of the argument, is that America is such a religiously diverse country that to be polite, we say, especially on something commercial like a Starbucks cup, happy holidays, or you just wish someone in an office say happy holidays. But those that are Christian particularly feel very strongly about the faith, want Merry Christmas and say it's the majority religion, the founding religion, or even that I have a friend who insists on it because he merely feels that it's still okay for him to wish someone a Merry Christmas regardless of what religion they are.
Yes, no, I must say that I think I'm very happy if someone wishes me Happy Diwali, which is a Hindu feast. Then, and I'm not a Hindu. I'd be delighted to be wished Happy Diwali. Nice.
These are the battles that and it's such a small matter. I think it's blown up in the media, but it's such a small matter among real people. There's probably a small percentage. And
again, you see that's another example of people seeking to be, of the dangers of things becoming divisive, isn't it? I mean, something like Happy Christmas or it should be a lovely time of year. Everyone. It unites everyone, and it's sad when something like that is sort of turned into becomes divisive, and one person turning against another. That is something one saw on a sort of bigger and much more vicious scale in the English Civil War.
We have this term that's in our politics now, the fake news, but it's really not new at all. In fact, I think there probably was some examples of, I know during our American Revolution that we probably, using it as a verb, trumped up a few pamphlets and things that maybe weren't true. And I believe during this conflict between Charles I and the parliamentarians that the fake news played a little role.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, certainly, particularly with the rebellion in Ireland, the exaggerated report. Well, obviously, there were atrocities on both sides in Ireland: Catholics against Protestant settlers, native Catholics against Protestant settlers, and there were horrific atrocities on both sides. The Catholic atrocities were greatly exaggerated, and to the extent that sometimes it was actually more than the entire Protestant population of Ireland was supposed to have been wiped out. So that was one example. And then the Queen and Henrietta Maria was blamed for it, although she had absolutely nothing whatever to do with it. So that's certainly one example of the kind of fake news. But yes, so there was several examples, often of blaming the women around Charles for him doing this or that.
In America, in our history, we received those populations that were most affected, whether really affected, or whether it was more paranoia, hysteria. We received a lot of those groups because I think the two major groups that come to America, the Puritans and then the Scots-Irish or Ulster-Irish, or those Protestants who had settled in the Ulster plantation, and it got so crowded and they came here.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, you certainly wouldn't want to get away, frankly.
Yeah.
Yes, I think where we're lucky now is that with the democracies we both have, whether it's a Republican democracy in your case or a constitutional monarchy in ours, is that we can trust when somebody is elected. They'll be elected by a majority, but they will rule for everyone, the majority and the minority, and we trust that they will protect the law for everyone, and then at the end of the X number of years, they will give up power calmly and move on, and we don't go and sort of hunt them down and murder them in their bunker or whatever, as if they were mad dictators. I
always do, yes. In politics, it seems these days, people think they're going to eliminate their opponents or something like that. And this is definitely, among other things, I think your story and the story of Charles I. A reminder about the premium podcast from My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, which is available at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. I really thank all of the people who have listened to this program, who have signed up. It's really helping to support the cast. A more general point, but we had kind of alluded to it quickly, that maybe some countries out there might be better even under a nice monarchy than anything else that they might have. And of course, only joking about it, America, some Americans looking to some other model. But I've always had this theory that, I'll give an example, that you have the National Health Service in your country. We have had a lot of trouble trying to establish national health insurance, or there are large groups of the population that don't even want such a concept of a centralized health system, or even a health system for everyone. It's like you have to earn it. This is, if you want healthcare, go out and work and the like. I do sometimes think that it may have been easier to establish something like a national health care or some protection for people in a country where people are subjects, where there is a one person whose job it is to take care for the people. Whereas in an absolute democracy where it's just, men and women governing men and women, there's not the concept of care may not be there enough. And it's like, well, we're all equal, so if you want something, work for it. Well,
I do sometimes wonder if monarchy wouldn't work better in some parts of the world which are sort of pre-democratic, if you look at Iraq, for example, now that we have sort of introduced democracy, but then it becomes one side, it becomes Sunni against Shia, but the Shia don't feel the Sunnis are ruling for all of them and are prepared to look after all of them. You have that kind of division, and that can be a problem when you have democracy in a country which hasn't got any history of it. I don't know whether a sort of monarchical system would work better there. I don't know, but it's a thought. But I'm not sure that I would agree with you that monarchy makes people more caring than republics, because I think there are plenty of countries in Europe that also have a health system, a national health system. I have to say that coming from Britain, I simply cannot understand. I cannot understand why it's such a big thing in in the United States. I would say I'm really quite small c conservative. So I'm certainly not a sort of mad, crazed radical, but very far from it, I would say. But it seems to me that there are people who are unable to work, or they lose their jobs, or they become sick with a chronic illness. I have to say, I do think the National Health Service is a wonderful system. You can have private health insurance as well. So I don't know if you want to have plastic surgery, or you want to jump the queue, to deal with your stubbed toe, or whatever it might be. You can go and do it. But if you have a heart attack in the street, or you have cancer or something, you're going to be looked after. And if you've lost your job, you'll still be looked after.
Yeah, my sense is what I had spoken to earlier. It might even be a result of the English Civil War, or the reaction to it, or the fact that we received so many people in the American population that came from a fight against central government in one form or another, either in. And
it's because it's central, is it? Is that the worry?
I think that's a big worry. Yes, that the argument that will commonly be heard is that I don't want Washington picking out what doctor I go to, and even though that's normally not the case where it happens.
But you can have both. I mean, you can have the national health system, and you can also have private health insurance. You can have both. I mean, we do here. But I'm slightly sort of getting off the point here. But I do find it. I think it's a mark of how foreign I am, really. I suppose that I don't really understand why people are so fearful of a national health system. Maybe they're worried by the expense.
The expense, these all figure in, and even the idea of mixing the private and the national, like you say, is definitely something that's often on the table, all of those options. But I think we're very rights-grounded here. I think we're very individualist, and I think that whether people admit it or not, it's so much in our DNA, really, historical DNA. Even as we are suburbans driving minivans and going to the Starbucks and the Home Depot, I think we still have a frontier mentality in politics, and also a fighting kings mentality and a rights-based mentality, that my individual right above all, even my own care. My neighbor or my own health care being diminished is not as important as my freedom being extinguished is in the background. Whether people say it or not, is in the background of so much thinking here. A little less on the East Coast and the West Coast than other parts, but I think that's probably the major factor.
But how does it? I don't understand how it extinguishes your freedom, because you pay taxes to have your roads built.
I mean, of course, there's huge support for it as well. It's just one of those issues under conflict. Yes. I would say it's probably a smaller percentage. There's probably more that would support it. But the process of getting representatives elected who would also support it and paying for it and passing the legislation has been onerous, and really goes back to, at the same time that you passed the national health care in the 1940s, there was an attempt to do so, and President Truman was behind it. But there was a tremendous amount of business opposition to it, and just to kind of, again, a little bit of this individualistic mentality that if Washington's controlling it, it won't be good, that I'll be paying too much for my neighbors, that my neighbors will be getting plastic surgery on me. And
certainly the idea, and this is very important to Charles, the idea of service, of looking after others. This was all a part of a hierarchical society. So, if you were a king or a nobleman or whatever, it wasn't just about, lucky on me, I'm king, or I'm a nobleman and I'm sort of better than you because I'm Lord Snooksbottom. I mean, you were expected to have, there were duties and responsibilities that went with that. And that was, you served and were obedient to the person above you, the king, if you were a nobleman, and you also cared, supposedly, and looked after those below you. You were, responsible for promoting the best of the people who worked for you, and you had a you had a duty of care. Basically, it was supposed to be like Christ. It was supposed to reflect Christ, the servant king.
numbers-wise, it's often said in the American Revolution, there's this thing, the third, and the third. In other words, a third for, a third against, a third in between. It's not really true. It's probably there's much more support for the revolution. Definitely in some geographic areas, the support was tremendous. So it's not as even as that. But what do you think in the English Civil War? Were the people generally Roundheads, or was it just a small group controlling things that made that war happen?
The mass of the people, you mean? I think quite a lot of them were fairly neutral. Quite a lot of people went to war because they thought they'd earn a few quid, and it sounded a bit less dull than sitting at home on the farm. I mean, just like young men never change, do they? Really?
That was in the American Revolution as well. Some of it was for the pay. I was just looking at Battle of Concord, and there were two people who were indigents that were being paid by the town of Lincoln, Massachusetts, and as soon as the Battle of Concord came along, they lucked out because now they're in the army and they're getting a paycheck. I don't think the revolution was on their minds at all.
No, exactly. So you had an element of that, but you also had people, particularly in actually the richer parts of England, who were more parliamentarian, and then people in the north and the west who were more largely royalist. There were sort of little pockets of different people in different places, but that was sort of geographically largely the case. But then you also got people changing sides. So in the north of England, when the Scots turned royalist, having been on the parliamentarian side, then the north, who hated the Scots, hated the Scottish invaders, then wouldn't rise a second time for the king. Because they hated the Scots, so you'd get people chopping and changing sides as well at all levels of society. Actually, as the politics shifted, as Parliament became more radical, so people would change. I think people were just very fed up by the end.
Charles's son, after this disastrous experimentation with the dictatorship, and Charles's son becomes king. Did he do a good job?
Well, he was more popular certainly than Oliver Cromwell.
Okay.
And he managed to pass on his throne to his brother, although that didn't last. Yes, so he did an okay job, I suppose.
He had such an influence on what would become the United States. There's so many charters and state boundaries that have his hand.
Yes. Well, I suppose it was a sort of key period in American history, wasn't it? And actually, one of the figures in my book, one of the leading parliamentarians, the Earl of Warwick, I think has several places in the United States named after him. Isn't there Warwick, Rhode Island?
New York, certainly. There's Warwick, New York. It's a nice winery up there. And so we think that's named after him because he was a supporter.
Yes, it was named after him. Well, because he was a great. He signed patents for the Mayflower, and was a great, privateer and backed many of these sort of New England colonies. So he was quite an important figure in that. The Earl of Warwick, Robert Rich, Earl of Warwick, as well as being key figure, often overlooked in the overthrow of Charles I. Great.
Well, this is just one of the many stories in The White King, Charles I, Traitor, Murderer, Martyr, by Leanda de Lisle. I have enjoyed speaking with her. Leanda, thanks for coming on today.
No, thank you. And actually, thank you. It's very interesting talking politics with you.
And our thanks to Leanda de Lisle for coming on the show today. A reminder about the premium podcast, www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.premium.com. Support the show and get bonus episodes. If you're looking for a gift for someone this season who might like history and politics, we have a gift premium subscription available. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. A happy holiday to all, and a bit of a show note that I think for the remainder of the year, the beginning of next, we'll be rerunning the episodes of A Dozen Ronald Reagans as I complete that series. I am working on the last 3 episodes. I really am. So we'll finish that out. But first, we're going to start with a replay of episodes 1 through 9. Episode 1 was first aired in 2016, so it's been some time, and we do have some new listeners to the program. Thanks for listening.